Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Right to Read initiative. My name is Dr. Kathryn Garforth from Garforth Education, and today I have the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Kelly Grillo, and we are talking about her role as the Special Education Director. Welcome today, Kelly. How are you?
Awesome. Thank you for having me back. I absolutely am excited about sharing my role as a special education director, considering I am also dyslexic. So, you and I had the pleasure of talking a couple of weeks ago, and I think this is really an important topic in terms of inclusion. Having an advocate both on the front lines and helping to lead the charge in a school corporation is, I think, really important for the work that we're doing.
Definitely. So can you give us a little bit of a description of what exactly your role as a director of special education includes?
Well, there's a lot of budget stuff, trying to make sure that both the students with individualized education plans have the supports and services as written in those plans takes a lot of time planning, programming, budgeting, working strategically with our treasurer, our CFO, that chief financial officer. So really that part of the job is not the most fun job, managing all the grant monies and making sure that I know what the federal law says that we can spend money on. So that part's not the fun part, but the fun part is really working at the school level with teams, making sure that they have the professional development that they require to be able to execute the plans inside of that specially designed, instruction. So that's really where I like to spend the majority of my time. I like to be in the buildings and in the classrooms and seeing our children, really helping to shape our special education teams, both the service providers, our classroom assistants, or our paraeducators, to understand what the IEP is being translated to for a day-to-day operational kind of standpoint. Really getting into those classrooms and seeing if students are making progress, that holding, all people accountable to expecting high outcomes. And really, how are we being both tight on things and flexible on things? And how are we communicating with parents? So that's a really tall drink of water, as we're also trying to ensure that we're both compliant with the law. But I talk with teams quite frequently about how do we get beyond just being compliant? How do we ensure that we are stretching ourselves to truly meet the parents and the students' life term, like the outcomes, getting to the point of are we building our programs and our knowledge and our skills to ensure students are able to be as independent as possible?
Yes, of course. And, the thing is, we need to make sure that IEPs, this is something that I come across all the time, as there, districts or ministries or whatever have this kind of standard set of IEP goals. And they just the goals and objectives are just kind of cut and paste and don't really meet the students' needs or helping them in any useful way based on their diagnosis and strength and weakness profile.
Right. Well, so that's where I go. I don't really, in terms of in here stateside, the law says that we should be building the IEP around the barriers. Like, what are the student strengths and where, in fact, are our students needing support and scaffolds? And a lot of times, if it's written well, it reads like a beautiful novel, right? Here's what Kelly can do. Here's the areas where Kelly is challenged. And then that would scaffold straight into the goals and the services and the supports and even the training. And so I really focus a lot of time with teams to take a look at, how does the disability impact me, the individual, and how can I become more fluent with those pieces so that I could be more independent? And how can the parents be trained as well and given supports and services? I feel like that's a component of the IEP that's often missed. How are we working as a team to support each other through that entire day of that individual? Because an IEP really should be serving that individual through their entire day. So, school ends, we have extracurricular activities, we have things that we have to do for homework and execution of using maybe your school issued device. Do our students know and have those executive functioning skills to be able to independently interact with homework? Or is homework a challenge and making the family fall apart and ruining family life? Those kinds of things. I think we tend to think, well, it doesn't happen within the school hours, so this IP shouldn't really serve all those things. So we really have to be more dynamic and be serving that child's areas of weaknesses in a way that everyone, no matter what class period, where in the schoolhouse or outside of the schoolhouse for social development and learning. As our kids get older, we should be even talking about gainful employment and transition supports. And, how is this student doing with independent life skills, like making themselves something to eat? A lot of times we just focus so much on reading and writing inside those IEPs. And I agree. We tend to do a cookbook method, like check this one, because it fits into the adults' lives in the schoolhouse. What we really should be doing is making that team look more dynamically. I do think because I'm disabled, I have that lens of how my disability impacts my entire day, whether it's getting ready in the morning to come to work on time and be my best side of myself, or if it's, after school and the things that I need to be able to be at my practice on time. And so a lot of times I'll team it in with our staff to say, well, if we're saying the student needs visual schedules and calendar reminders and this, have we looked beyond just the 7-hour school day? Have we helped them with, the things I need to pack in my backpack the night before and giving that visual schedule or checklist that they can use? Or are we teaching them how to use Google Keep, technology tools to make a checklist that they can use day in and day out and coach that? So a lot of times our kiddos with, working memory deficits, they need those things daily, and we might not be able to be there. So have we sent them a video recording to say, you're going to have a great day? Did you remember to put your lunch in your backpack? Like maybe they can play that every day on their school issued device first thing. So just really thinking in a way that we are specially designing that curriculum. I find that we tend to say, well, we offered this or we offered that. And just the offering of something doesn't execute the follow through and the implementation and really getting that individual to know how to use those routines or tools. So we have to model them, we have to coach them, and then we have to use that gradual release model to release it to the student and then work on the next skill.
Of course. And the thing that, at least in my experience, I mean, maybe yours is similar, but teachers get a student with an IEP and they're like, more work, right? I have to go through the IEP, possibly the psych ed, try and learn about this student. But I find the teacher education programs don't put the focus that is needed on understanding the psychoeducational assessment and creating IEPs that are actually going to be useful for them. Instead of having a recipe that's listing best practices, it needs to be individualized for the students so they know the why and they know the how. And it means, okay, so we are doing something in class when the student is being asked to read, but the reading itself is not the assessment. It is a means to the end. Use a audio, like use something like Speechify. Right?
Yeah.
So the student doesn't have to read. It's going to reduce the time and it's going to improve the comprehension. Depending, like this isn't the answer for all students, right?
Right.
But for giving it prescriptive so that they can say, okay, you know what? You spend the time to understand this. Your life as a teacher is going to be so much better. Things are going to be easier and we're going to see behavior improvements for this child. and outcome improvements.
Yeah, so even with something as simple as a language, whether the language impairment is driving the ability to comprehend. So I have worked with teams to think about putting reading passages. If you want students to be able to do something with the reading, there's something called it's a reading passage analyzer where it will level the vocab into tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3. It's on the website Achieving the Core. And so you could put any piece of reading through that. And so maybe as an accommodation, we narrow down the vocabulary that we know the student's going to struggle with. So we have maybe a key above the passage that says, the word unusual means that it's not typical or it's out of the ordinary, or we help them to understand that if you don't know this word, it's going to prohibit you from unlocking the meaning of the text. And if you're not really trying to measure that student's vocabulary knowledge, but you're trying to get to, let's say, the content of learning biology, you would do these things as a scaffold. And I don't see that happening very often. And there's many, many students, the majority of our students that have that specific learning disability come comorbid with a language impairment. And yet I don't see the scaffolds in our environments for students with language impairments to have language supports. So if we're giving maybe like a translation dictionary to a student with a second language, why wouldn't we also give that dictionary or a personal word learning list to a student with a language impairment? And often I never see these things in an IEP, and I'm a person with a language impairment. And although my vocabulary is very broad now, as a young child, I was mostly confused. I could decode the words at a certain point, but I didn't know what the majority of the words meant. And so if we know that a student is language impaired, and they also have working memory needs, we would provide the scaffold of giving those language targets even during a test if we're not measuring their language knowledge. So I think, dynamically across, what is prohibiting the child from progressing, why is the impairment or the identified disability getting in the way of their progress, and what can we put in place to really level the playing field. So there's some research that says typically in a school day, our students with disabilities have their needs really violated over and over and over. And so there's some legislation out there that talk about the ease of use and the equitable substantial ease of use. And so typically students with disabilities have to do 2 to 3 to 4 steps more than their non-disabled peers. And so we've got to really think cognitively, what are the processes that are happening? And the ed report can show that, that psychological exam. But if the school psychologist isn't spending a lot of time with helping the team to unpack strategies, we have to think if extended time is not going to happen beyond the number of school days, and it's not going to happen beyond the number of days in a grading period, let's say 45 days. How can we give extended time on every single thing? What we have to do is mitigate the factor slowing the processing down. So maybe we allow students to design their own note card to help them with memory devices for a test, and they use it on the test. Please don't just give a student a book and say open book test. It is the worst accommodation for a person with a disability because they have to reread that entire chapter 20 times during that test, and then they're going to miss the rest of their class if they have extended time, right? So we want to make sure that we are chunking in a way to help working memory, and we want to be giving appropriate accommodations, and it might not come out of your checklist. So if you're using a computerized IEP program, the checklist is sometimes the minimal of what we can do if we're being truly creative for individuals with disabilities. Think about if a student has a traumatic brain injury. Their brain is not working like everyone else, or a concussion. They may not be able to pathway into their memory. You pull out the file cabinet and you think you want to go to C and you really go to T and you don't understand why. And so we want to make sure that we are narrowing down those skills in which get to what we're hoping for an outcome. and we put scaffolds all the way along. And if you're not quite sure how to do that, there's so many things that you could be doing to study. You can go to like the Iris Center at Vanderbilt. There's tons of free training on how to make accommodations and strategy instruction and really help you to think through what we're providing. Hold up, sorry, I'm sorry I didn't get that out. But in Texas, in Austin, I believe Region 13 came up with, it's really a research-based approach to accommodations. And so you can pick your areas of need, and they'll give you a report of who typically would need those types of accommodations based on the learner profile. And so it's called Accommodation Central. I believe it's still open access to anybody on the internet, but they've done a great job creating that and making sure that it is growing through a research-based way to providing accommodations. Back in 2006, I want to say, I worked with a gentleman from Region 13 from the service center in Austin, and we had this deep conversation about how are educators selecting those supports and those scaffolds, and what do they know about our learners? And so we wanted to take the barrier out of that work, and he developed it with a great set of amazing educators. They interviewed folks, they looked at IEPs, and they came up with these pathways. And it's amazing. It's gotten better over time. And so I really encourage folks to take a look at that. I think as a special education director with a disability, knowing that my needs have changed across my lifespan and across every new opportunity, knowing that those conversations should be really deep and should involve the learner. So as our learners age, we have things in the law that say we have to involve them, but what we really have to do is listen. So a lot of times we say advocate, advocate, advocate. If we actually listen and execute what learners request, we will get to a better place in learning outcomes. A lot of times I have students that will request to retake an exam or do test corrections because maybe they got language confused. I was speaking with a family just today that the student sadly got the word antonym and synonym completely confused, and they made a 0 on a test. The teacher conferred that the student did absolutely know all of the language, but would not allow the student to retake an examination for credit because she had spoken through the quiz. And I said, well, hold up, what's the goal here? Is it to prove that the student has knowledge of language, or is it to give them a 0 and teach them a lesson that they should know in the prompt, antonym and synonym? So if you want to measure their understanding of those two words, clearly she failed because she got them confused because of her impairment. But if we want to know if she knew the words in the assessment and you spoke through them and you tell a parent, I know she knew the words, then why are we counting a 0 in the grade book? So we've got to really think, what is the goal and what is the expected outcome? And is this student who has an impairment, is this student making mastery? Because if it's the print and the way in which you're assessing, if that is getting to 0s, then I'm going to share with you, you need to try a different way. And that's really what the law says. And so it's having those conversations at a really critical level, because school leaders who sign off on these IEPs need to know that even if it's a burden or we think it's too much work to make a second, third, or fourth, version of an assessment, or putting images in an assessment, or chunking the assessment into 3 small components versus expecting a student with a major cognitive, deficit to do the bulk of what everyone else is doing. We might say alternative testing sessions where we do part of the test day 1, part of the test day 2, and part to lower the stress, because you may be actually measuring the cognitive overload of the student and not actually the knowledge. And so we've got to do a much better job, especially when it comes to assessment. But when we're thinking about instruction, the same thing. If the student is in cognitive overload or they're in that fight or flight brain state, they're not going to learn much. So we have to make sure that it's a calm work environment, that we're using memory devices, mnemonic devices, maybe stories, riddles, rhymes, making songs out of large bodies of text, things that we have to memorize large amounts of and really chunk it down. I think a lot of folks don't know that in cognitive science, we would group things into like 3 or 4 chunks, but yet I see vocabulary lists of 12 words. And so, why, if we know best practice is to give 3 items and to really get that into working memory and in long term memory for retrieval, why would we give a kiddo 12 items? And especially a kiddo that's impaired. Maybe they need to learn 1 item at a time. And so I do think we need to know what cognitive researchers are sharing is best practice. I share constantly. There's a rule called it's 5 ± 2. If a student is very impaired, we're going to only give them 3 items to truly get into that long-term memory. And we're going to rehearse those things for multiple days, maybe 5 days, 6 days, maybe 10 full days. And if they're pretty academically advanced with no cognitive impairment, we're going to say 5 + 2, right? So we can go up to 7 items for a very, very talented student. If the student is just a typical kiddo with, no deficits, no gifts, maybe they get 5 things. So if we think in terms of that, we should be chunking material in a way that students can actually have those items palatable and be able to get to a successful place. I don't think it's any teacher's job or desire to come in and grade a whole bunch of Fs. But if you're grading class reports and more than 70% of your class is not getting it, you've got to do something different. If you're looking at the learners with deficits, maybe, English language learners, students with identified disabilities, students with maybe progress monitoring in that RTI or MTSS, that whole, progress monitoring cycle, or students with 504 plans, if you're noticing they're clustering in the same place and it's not where you're hoping, we've got to do something different. And so I would hope that we're really analyzing our grade books and analyzing our practices to say, what can we do to change ourselves to get better outcomes? Because at the end of the day, we want to learn. And I've been citing a lot. There's a law in special education in states, and it was Andrew versus the board. And what that law showed is that both the goals were not rigorous and we weren't trying to get to that on like grade level standard, but also the training and the support and the scaffolds were not appropriate. And so we want to make sure that instruction is rigorous and also comes with scaffolds. And so some people are like, that's a dichotomy. How can you have high expectation and rigor if you're also putting so many scaffolds? Well, I can share with you from being disabled and teaching high school biology, that's the same exact general education class. I can get really far outcomes using best practice, using cognitive science, using how the brain learns, making rehearsals, taking 3 minutes each day to rehearse targeted vocabulary terms and using it and celebrating. So there are ways to look at your curriculum, put the curriculum through, response to intervention and say, what's going to be most challenging for all kids and put scaffolds in place for that material. What's going to be challenging for some kids and still put some tools in place to help some kids learn those things. And at the top, what is going to be the most challenging that only, a little bit, we're going to still address that because that's probably where special education is coming to place. And it shouldn't be the barrier of only, or the burden, I should say, the burden of only the general education teacher, but in that top quadrant where the content is most challenging, we should be consulting special education teachers and program designers and think really critically. Maybe you have an assistive technologist that will help. Maybe you have somebody that will scaffold and make you a multimedia piece because you want to layer in something funny and quick and a 1-minute review with visual images, but that's not your thing as a general education teacher. We need to collaborate. We are not going to be able to be the jack of all trade and be all to all students on those rosters, but that's why we have special education teachers in the building. So maybe back to the language piece, if you know you're not shaping your curriculum across the hardest to reach language, then you should be partnering and pairing it in with a special education teacher, because they should have some understanding of how to break apart language, because language is where my heart lives pretty deeply. If you look at the simple view of reading, we know that decoding with language comprehension is going to get to overall comprehension. So if we are addressing the language of our content and shaping it and unpacking it, kids are going to have a much better chance of learning that content. If we're constantly seeing, again, the same pattern of children getting D's and F's or not making the marks or growing to where we're hoping, I would say that every educator needs to collaborate over language. You're going to get your biggest bang for your buck if you start growing in your own better use of language. We have research to suggest the language the teacher uses in class and modeling for students, and really shaping and asking for students to rephrase and say something in a more eloquent or more academic way. We're going to be growing their skills. So we should make the students have the language in their mouths and reward them. You cannot orthographically process and map language unless you speak it. You have to hear it and you have to speak it. So I'm never going to expect a kid to be able to decode a multisyllabic word that's a domain 3 or like very domain specific in like sciences without me modeling it and then me having them say it back to me. And so we have to unpack that language. But all of that should absolutely be specially designed instruction in the IEP. And our colleagues, both general education teachers and special education teachers, with the support of people like me. If you need more training in that area, I should be able to come to your classroom and help model that. I believe all of us instructional leaders should have talents and skills to walk the walk. I mean, truly, I should be coming to your class and helping you to do that. And I do. I schedule time with teachers and I model lessons, and I care about that, because if I had somebody being coached in my early years, I would have probably struggled a lot less.
Of course, and the important thing to remember is just because you're doing this for one student in your class doesn't mean that all students are not going to benefit, especially when we're looking at that vocabulary review. Getting that list of however many words, especially as students get older, and it's not just one class, we're going to have more students mastering more vocabulary words across the curriculum and the subject areas if that built-in review is there in every class.
Absolutely. So one of the things I love to look at is scopes and sequences of, let's say, morphology. So we know certain prefixes are appropriate to teach early. I'm saying as early as first, second grade. We know certain suffixes are also appropriate to teach as early as first and second grade, right? And I'm saying first and second grade because I really feel like that's when we've left that whole letter identification and phonemic awareness, and we may be tightening it up still in first and second grade for some kiddos, but we should have that base understanding of how words come together, right? Bringing words to life kind of thing. But so I really love to have a scope and sequence all the way through from those early years through grade 12. And then we're spiraling the rehearsals and spiraling that reinforcement all the way through until kids need to take really, there's important tests. Not every universities have gotten rid of, the SAT, let's say. College Board drives a lot of decisions in people's lives. If we're going to be going off to university, to even community colleges, we're going to be taking those pre-SAT and the SAT. And we want students to be able, no matter who they are, to sit at these tests and be able to, get the score that represents their intelligence. And so a lot of times these tests do not do that because they've not had enough rehearsal time with language. And so I tell a little story about myself. It's a hard story to tell, but when I took the graduate record exam, I scored a very poor score. I got a 640 the very first time I took the test. I scored 540 in the mathematics, but the verbal, I got 100 points. It's almost the dead lowest score you can get. And I went to my PhD interview still with knowing I did not make a 1,000 cutoff score. going to defend why. And one of the faculty members at that interview leaned forward and laughed and said, "Did you take both parts?" And I had to say yes, but I'm incredibly impaired with language and verbal ability. I said, however, none of my college grades at the undergraduate or master's level reflected that. And so, as a whole committee is giggling and you're told, no, thank you, come back next year, try again. At what certain level do you want to go back to your school and say, you did this to me? I felt very angry at the outcomes that I was able to achieve, even though I've had success as an adult with a disability. In my mind, I should have had far more because I'm capable of far more. And so I did a lot of studying after that GRE, debacle. And I decided I'm going to study for 1 year. And I did it on an elliptical in the morning every single day with GRE flashcards. And I also took a Princeton review kind of, GRE class. I paid $1,000 to take a class. And now I'm saying this because I was privileged, right, to be able to do this. And so I not only afforded myself the time, and I learned about cognitive science, and I did things like, making funny stories for words and drawing a mental picture. And I did all these things. But I should have known these strategies from my grade school, from my middle school years, from my high school, because I sat in front of important tests before and still needed language. And so, as a special education director, I think I share that a lot with folks, and I try to get people to think dynamically about the whole individual and what they're going to need lifelong. And I constantly say that our language is currency, because it is. Your language and your ability to process language is directly proportional to how much you earn. And so I am very, very lucky in my life.
Well, and I was going to say a lot of those high stake tests are multiple choice.
Mhm.
And I remember in some of the psychology courses that I took at university in my undergrad, there was subtle differences in the language that I just couldn't tease out for a multiple choice question. It's just not something that my comprehension can do in a timed situation when things are so close. And if we look at, statistics and measurement theory, well, multiple choice actually isn't best. It's
Yes.
easiest
Yeah.
for the assessor, but it's not the best showing of knowledge. And a lot of these tests don't have the same psychometric review that is needed to say that it's actually testing what it's saying is testing.
Correct. I mean, I don't put a lot of clout in them. However, they're still there. And so our kids absolutely need some skills. So I learned something which is amazing, and my test scores turned completely upside down overnight. And I teach kids this. So you read the prompt, whether you're reading it with your ears through some audio accommodations or a human reader, or you're reading it with your eyes, or maybe you're reading it tactily, but you don't look at the answers, and you write down what comes to your mind first, what you believe is the answer. So you write out the verbal response. And then you find through the multiple choice the one that mirrors what you wrote from your gut reaction most closely. And my test scores went completely upside down when it came to verbal ability because of those nuance. The distractors are designed to be plausible. So then you second guess yourself 50,000 times, right? Especially if you've been very poor at taking tests. But if you read the item, the question, and you have something to say, so let's say verbally, you would orally say, this is what it is. If you wrote that down and then found the parallel structure, you're probably going to be more confident that that is accurate. And I've done this with kids time and time out, and they do great. I also have learned something called a brain dump. And so, they teach this in high leverage test skills. And so before I even look at a test, I take a blank sheet of paper and I draw pictures that mean something to me, and I dump out everything I can think about things that may be on that test. And what is measured, then I'm able to stay a little more calm because I won't forget because I've studied all this stuff, right? And I draw a lot of pictures because when you're stressed, your frontal lobe controls speech and impulsivity. And so if I can think in pictures, like maybe it's DNA replication and I have 5 steps and I have little pictures, I can then read the items about DNA replication and get closer to where I should be. And so learning these strategies, and I learned them as an adult. I did not learn them as a child in school. And I was still facing assessments that were high stakes, right? You're taking the SAT to be able to go to college, you're taking assessments that say what class you can go to. I mean, we act like we don't do leveling and pathwaying, but we do. We have gatekeepers. And so if we are not getting true measurements and true information on kids, we are really getting in the way of their full potential. And so I think a lot of that lived experience is a part of what I bring as my role of special education director, helping people to understand that persons with disabilities, identified disabilities, and maybe persons without yet identified disabilities, that we're valuable, that just because in a culture that doesn't value differentness and doesn't value alternative ways of thinking and doing things, I really feel like it's my job in every system that I work to help reshape the thinking of kind of that mainstream or where the middle is, to help us to be able to be great. Because when we do that, we elevate the entire community. And what we see is the kids at the top, they grow further. And all of the NAEP scores for districts and states that adopted the science of reading, we see at the top the kids that were achieving well before changing practice, they're achieving even better. And kids that were, making the mark of below proficient and, really below proficient, like grossly below, that they're getting closer to proficiency. So I think if we look at the opportunity in changing our instruction and changing how we design curriculum based on cognitive science, everybody's happier. Teachers will come to school happier because children are learning more and the lift will get easier over time. I don't expect educators to change everything in all 1 minute, but I do ask for people to layer their curricula so that you are able to see change over time, layer strategies in over time, collaborate. Maybe I do the bell ringers because I'm going to activate everybody's thinking about a topic and get you excited and lower, some of that stress hormone in the brain. But maybe I'm really good at doing that. And so I'm going to write all those for our team for, let's say, a biology course. I don't know. And then maybe you're going to write like the formative assessment. And then we're going to really make sure to differentiate that. And we get the special education teacher to write up, some of those, I call them linking routines. So the University of Kansas has something called link strategy. It's a content enhancement routine. And, you can go out to the web and take a look at those, but they have lots of different research-based strategies and routines. And some of the strategies are for the teacher to take their curriculum through, which I prefer that instead of always putting the heavy lift on the child, on the students, on the struggling learners. Yes, we want them to learn things to better know how their brain learns, but I feel like we put so much responsibility onto the individual where we really need to be shaping activities and experiences so that we can get more out of the learning environment. But that is what I offer, I believe, when I'm a part of, an IEP team, a case conference team, whatever you want to call it, that, that team that's specializing the instruction. And I like to be invited, and I like to be invited frequently and often, and not after we have F's posting. I want to be more proactive about how kiddos are doing. I often tell special education teachers, you don't have to just progress monitor at the end of the semester. We want to be doing that early.
Of course. And one thing I definitely wanted to hit on with you is advocacy, because it's hugely important. But I'm seeing kids pushed into it before they're ready, especially at a very young age when they haven't even had the diagnosis for a year.
Mm. So I think a lot of that, like, oh, the learner has to speak up. There is a lot of research on what's called generalization. So me as an adult learner taking comprehensive exams as a professional learner, as a professional student teaching university classes, I went into a comprehensive exam and did not advocate for my use of a screen reader. And I listened back to all of my writing because my brain doesn't pick up the nuances of like maybe doubles, like if I wrote not in a line or if I omitted a word. But when I listen back to what I have authored, I'm able to pick up those nuances a lot easier. Or like some of the grammar, I could say, oh, that doesn't sound quite right. I might inverse a sentence and it just doesn't sound right. So I don't pick that up unless I have a screen reader. I did not advocate for my own use of a screen reader when writing about 350 years of learning disabilities and the laws, all the way from the European footholds to present day. Now I had the information, oddly enough, and I could tell you all about it. But when writing about it, it was disorganized. Lisa Deeker was my dissertation chair, and she was the first read of my comp exams. And she called me and said, "You fail. This question's terrible." And I was like, "Oh, wow, thanks. Thanks for the quick feedback on that." But she's like, but I'm going to take it to the committee because you also didn't advocate. And she's like, this is a perfect example of you should have advocated to listen to this because you would have been able to recognize that it's crap. I mean, and she was being gentle and kind, no doubt. But she's like, Kelly, I see the way you work, and the way you work in a typical day. You went to this new experience and you didn't bring the tools from your toolkit. But I didn't even think to. I thought, well, it would be cheating if I did it differently than my colleagues. There's only 5 of us and it has to be rigorous. And I'm locked in a room for 4 hours to write from my mind. Who knew I could use a screen? Like, I didn't even think that it was applicable, right? And so she went to my committee. And what I did with that item, I didn't add to the writing. I reorganized the writing and I created a presentation, like a PowerPoint, to say in this piece of writing, you're going to learn about A, B, C. Then I'm going to tell you about that. And then to conclude, but I took that writing and just chunked and redesigned a presentation that I had to present to them verbally, because clearly what I had written in without the writing center and without accommodations and without any of those tools, it was trash. I still have it. It's on a shelf right back here. If anybody wants to read it, I can scan it and put it out there. It's pretty terrible.
But it contains the right information.
Correct. And I've gone on to present the actual presentation that I've shared with my committee many, many, many times. And so it's quality information. It just wasn't well written.
Yeah. And that's so often the case. I can think so many times where I've had similar experiences and it's like, well, don't you just understand how my brain works?
Yeah, like, didn't you hear my internal dialogue? And like, so I think I shared prior, or I don't remember actually, but a lot of times when talking to my husband at home, I'll start mid-story and he'll say, hold up, wait, I have no context of what you're talking about. Can you back up? You had half of this conversation in your mind. And then I go, oh yeah, sorry. Or the opposite happens. I tell him so many details, he gets lost and he says, well, Kelly, what is the point? Let me help you. Let's chunk this. Like, so I do know if that's still me as an adult with dyslexia, all of our kids with those same learning profiles are feeling those things. So we have to help them with chunking and graphic organizers and, those pre-writing strategies and post-writing strategies and going back for those, second attempts at doing these things in a more eloquent way. And that's not cheating. A lot of times with advocacy, I tell parents to advocate for redos. We should be allowing students with multiple processing differences an extra attempt or 2 or 3 if they're still motivated to continue throwing themselves in the lion pit, to continue to work on mastering what we're hoping they will. Why wouldn't we allow them to do that? And I mean, I've had other special ed directors go, well, we only let this, or we only let that, or is that fair? I said, you know what? It's not fair that my brain is neurodivergent. It's not fair that it takes me twice as long to do things. It's not, I would gladly give this to the whole class so that everybody had to learn like me. But that's not possible, right? So, when we want to talk about fairness, let's talk about fairness. But so it is absolutely fair to give a graphic organizer while a student is taking a written exam. It is absolutely fair to let them have an editor. It is absolutely fair to let them use real world tools that help me to be successful every day as a gainfully employed adult who is highly valued in my organizations, any of them that I've ever been in, to access these things so that they can be productive adults. It's not getting in the way of them being productive. I think what happens is we take one psychometric and we want to say, we're not going to allow these things because we want to isolate outcomes and we want the variables to be right. And we don't want any covariates. I try to talk to parametric design folks and people that do this great work to say, why don't we universally design these assessments, turn all of these pieces on, and then look at the kids that chose to turn on the screen reader and compare them against each other, disability or not, and look at the kids that do not turn it on and compare them against each other, disability or not. And why don't you just find some cut scores that make sense in there? Because what I hate to think is I'm going to use the word crippling. You are crippling a whole population of students even more by trying to take variables away and to isolate certain things when you're creating a system of haves and have-nots, and it's not a true measure of ability. And so I'm very, very outspoken against that. I speak about this quite a bit because our state assessment tool tries to say that only a small number of students should have a read aloud. Well, that's not true. The IEP team should be making the decision if that student can master and show their competencies, and that IEP team should absolutely be making that decision. No other outside force, an IDOE, and none of them. And I sit in these meetings and cringe because I know it's a violation of people's civil rights. In the smarter balance states that are using some of the items released by AIR, our AIR assessment, smarter balance states have something called a smarter balance checklist. And some of the things on that checklist create a situation that would make an IEP team say no to text-to-speech. One such thing is if the student is receiving really the science of reading, a structured research-based reading intervention. Why should it be on that measure if you click no, the student is not because the school's not offering it or it doesn't exist in a whole organization? That should not count against an individual with an impairment, with an IEP, in order to get an appropriate accommodation on a statewide exam that holds really big drivers in their life.
Of course. And the thing that I always like to add in, any student with glasses is allowed to take their glasses into an exam with no question, no advocacy, no notes, no expensive testing or anything. If we have a student who is blind, they can have Braille without much fuss. And I'm not saying that they should have to fight for it. It should be automatic that they get it. And we need to make it so our individuals with learning disabilities and language disabilities have the same supports and aren't requiring to pay to get access to education.
Correct. So I often say, if you want to know how well a student decodes, give them a decoding test. If you want to know the intelligence and what they know about topics, let them access the text in whatever means they need. I mean, short of skywriting it or theatrical dancing, but whatever is appropriate for that child and that individual learner. Because if we're not doing that, we do not get a true score. And so I am a proponent of universally designed assessments. If we are universally designing assessments, we put the learner and the test taker in the driving seat. Mentioning driving, most states offer a universal design test. You can put it in a different language. You can put it in reading with your ears. You can adjust how you access the driver's test. If we're saying driving and knowing the rules of the road is high stakes, and we want all people to have that measured appropriately, we then design that test so that all people can access it in the best mode for their understanding and their cognitive ability. Why wouldn't we do that with any end of year test? I really feel strong about it. And I think I'm coming back to talk about assistive technology.
Yeah.
But in terms of my seat as a special education director, I believe that I'm an advocate for the families that come to my school, the children that attend our school program here. And so I am very outspoken about this. And I'd rather deal with the opposite end of working with our school lawyers to stand up for families rather than getting our families to fight against us. Right? So I think that's a different view, because most people do the opposite. Like they'll let the school lawyer defend choices that might not be appropriate. So I come with a different lens because I'm a different individual, and most individuals like me don't end up in positions like this. And so I feel like I have a grave responsibility, and I owe it to our families and I owe it to our learners to follow IDEA and the law of special education to the best of my ability as dynamically as humanly possible.
Yeah, and I think when you're an individual that has had some life experience, living, it's not like you turn off your learning disability.
No.
It's there every day, every hour. You can choose to do activities that don't tax it as much, but there's some individuals that have that passion ignited in them saying, this isn't fair and we need to do better.
Absolutely.
And that's definitely, you're one of those. And thank you for everything that you do.
Well, thank you. I think it's been lovely today. I really appreciate you shedding light on, the role of special education directors and really my unique role as one with a disability.